Hello, I'm Mark Norman, folklore researcher and author, and welcome to a very special episode of the Folklore Podcast. In today's episode, which was recorded live at the Bookery, an independent bookshop in Crediton, Devon, you'll be able to hear me interview BBC Radio 6 Music's Zakia Sewell. As well as being a DJ and broadcaster, Zakia is a writer with a passion for history as well as music and the arts. We're discussing her debut non-fiction work, Finding Albion, which explores British national identity, folk culture and myth through its seasonal events. The book grew out of a previous radio series for Radio 4 on the same topic, and it's a fascinating and important exploration of this area. I hope you enjoy this special episode, recorded on location. So welcome to everybody who is sitting here in the Bookery, and also welcome to everybody who is listening later on the Folklore Podcast. It's great to see there is a full room here, especially when you consider that we are in direct competition to a film screening with themed puddings at the Arts Centre tonight as well. Yeah.
Thank you for your great sacrifice.
Yeah, see, if you'd known that, half of them wouldn't have been there, I'll tell you. First off, we need to welcome Zakia, of course, but we do also need to congratulate Zakia for, this is Zakia's first book, which is already longlisted for the Women's Prize for this year for non-fiction, so hurrah for that. I'd like to start by just asking you a little bit about the fact that you were born in a very urban environment, a very urban area, yet here we are talking about folk and folklore. So how were you introduced to this subject and why has it stuck with you?
Very good question. I grew up in a place called Hounslow, which is in West London. It's very close to Heathrow Airport, not a particularly green and pleasant place. Not much folk, as far as I know, although there was a big South Asian community. So I kind of, my primary school, we sort of celebrated Diwali, and we sort of had a lot of the kind of South Asian traditions, less of the British ones. But I grew up in a very musical household. My dad was a massive fan of, jazz and, soul and all sorts of different types of music and folk. So when I was 15 years old, he took me to see a band called Pentangle, who were playing at the Royal Festival Hall. I think it was their 40th anniversary concert. I can't remember which album. It'd been 40 years since it had come out. But at the time, I was sort of listening to grime and R&B. I sort of was like in my tracksuits and my hair slicked back. But somehow he convinced me to go, and this was an utterly transformative moment for me. I sort of kept it a secret from all my friends, but something about the music that I heard that evening just spoke to me on a really deep level. And, I don't know how many people here are familiar with Pentangle's music, but, they were part of that sort of 1960s, 1970s folk revival. But they were interesting because they fused those sort of older British folk songs, many of them sort of collected in the late 19th and early 20th century by people like Cecil Sharp and others. But they fused them with psychedelia and sitars and blues and sort of jazz rhythms. So it's a kind of heady blend of influences. And the music that I heard that evening, it seemed to sort of emanate from a very different kind of Britain, a Britain that was sort of magical and enchanted. And there were these kind of old stories of, lovers sort of longing for sailors lost on the raging seas, and just these incredible, powerful stories. And after that gig, I sort of became I started downloading. I downloaded in particular a song called The Cuckoo, which I write about in the book, on an album called Basket of Light, and sort of communed with it for a long time, sort of in secrecy.
Oh, the cuckoo, she's a pretty bird. She sings as she flies. She bringeth good tidings. She telleth no lies.
from Pentangle's music, I started listening to people like Davy Graham and Shirley Collins and other sort of people from that folk revival. Then started, becoming really interested in the tales of the Druids and the pagans. I watched The Wicker Man, I think, a year later, which was another formative moment. And then sort of as I got a bit older, started kind of becoming curious about sort of seasonal customs and things like that. And that was really where it all started. I have to thank Pentangle and my dad for having the bright idea to take me to see them all those years ago.
You watched the 1973 Wicker Man, not the Nick Cage remake,
I haven't
right?
watched it. I've seen clips, but I've not watched that one.
Clips is all you need to see.
That was enough.
All right. So we are here to talk about Finding Albion, so let's dive into this. So this is, by your own description, your quest to find Albion. It's very Arthurian sounding. It's like a kind of holy grail of our identity, if you like, as well. So before you launched into this, because there's a lot of research that went into this book, what did you think you were trying to find? What was Albion in your head when you started this whole process off?
Well, I think I've always had a slightly complicated relationship with my Britishness, and I've never lived anywhere else. I was, born in London, family in Wales, spent a lot of time there growing up and, exploring the landscape there. Both my parents are born here. My dad is English, Welsh. My mum is Caribbean from a place called Carriacou, which is a part of Grenada, but she was also born here. And I think as a young person, there was no sort of question about my belonging. I felt very at home in Britain, but then sort of becoming a teenager and sort of becoming aware of my position as someone of mixed heritage, of my race, having experiences that kind of led me to question my belonging and whether I was sort of allowed to belong here. And yet, but that love was there, and that real sort of profound sense of connection to the land and the landscape and sort of the natural world was there. So there was this sort of tension, and I think that's why I was so drawn to, those examples of folk culture when I first was exposed to them, because it was sort of like, oh, it's a Britain that I feel I can belong to, because it's eccentric and it's sort of strange and it's sort of, you hear these kind of radical stories of rebels and misfits and outsiders, and I was just really, really drawn to it because it seemed to have nothing to do with the Britain of sort of empire, of kind of rule Britannia and sort of God Save the Queen and, military and monarchy. And that for me, it always sort of left me feeling a bit cold or because I suppose of my connection to, the former colonies through my mum's side of the family. I could see through that. I kind of knew the kind of shadowy underbelly of those other kind of more conventional national symbols and stories. And so my search for Albion, I think, was a search for an alternative. It was a search for a kind of vision of Britain and of our past that was sort of enchanted and magical and inclusive and progressive, that had nothing to do with all of that kind of dark stuff. Is that what I found? We'll see later on whether that is what you found. So to guide you through this process, you use something which we have in common, in fact, because both you and I, so in my book on the folklore year in Britain, and in your book on the folklore year in Britain, essentially, we both use the Wheel of the Year as a mechanism for going through this process. Can you just describe what the Wheel of the Year is and why you chose to follow that? Yeah, absolutely. So the Wheel of the Year is a kind of seasonal cycle of celebrations. So in the book, I think similarly with yours, I sort of start at the spring equinox, May Day, which is obviously tomorrow. So it's kind of it marks the solstices and the equinoxes and their kind of midpoints in between. It's largely a kind of modern invention, sort of a neo-pagan kind of fabrication, you might say, but it's very much kind of rooted in older, often Celtic traditions and practices. So I think that it was a wonderful way to structure the book. I mean, there's so many kind of wonderful stories and sort of events, when we're thinking about that Wheel of the Year. But also it's a kind of journey from light, from the kind of optimism of spring, through the kind of wild abandon of summer at its peak, which I spend at the Notting Hill Carnival. Through into the dark half of the year, Samhain, the kind of the festival that Halloween is based on, which is all about the dead and the darkness, and I think that when we think that was an opportunity in the book to sort of reflect on the kind of the ghosts haunting the nation, and through to the winter solstice and back around to spring again. And I think that kind of balance between light and dark, and this sort of need to be able to acknowledge both and find ways to sort of celebrate both was really important, and is a kind of theme that runs through the book, I think. And it just meant I got to go on this wonderful quest, throughout the year, travelling all around the country, meeting people, having fascinating conversations, and sort of getting stuck in at some of the wonderful seasonal customs that happen.
Well, getting stuck in is right, because how did you decide to get stuck in? Well, you got stuck in by throwing yourself in at the deep end for your first visit, spring equinox, in Glastonbury, right?
Yeah.
Woo meter set to 11 for you for this one, all right? How did you find that whole experience?
It was great. I've been to Glastonbury before, so I knew what to expect, and I kind of write in the book, it's a sort of, strange sort of blend of spiritual seekers and lost souls. I don't know, I'm probably somewhere in the middle. But, I went up Glastonbury Tor, at 4:00 in the morning for this Druid ceremony. And, I think when I first got up there, I was feeling a little bit suspicious of some of the people around me, perhaps. But it was wonderful. And this Druid, he kind of led us through this ceremony, but it was all about love. It was quite hippy dippy, but in a really lovely way. And it was about the relief of spring coming after a dark and dismal winter, and just sort of marking that with a group of strangers, and sort of holding hands. I was a bit sort of uncertain about that at the start, but holding hands and singing a few songs together, but there's something really unifying about it, and about the way that it sort of connects you to strangers. So I found it was a wonderful experience, and like in a great way to start the quest. And there was a point where after the ceremony, people started banging drums, and this woman took all her clothes off and started dancing, and I was like, okay, that's my cue to leave. That was my cue to leave. Yeah. But Glastonbury was sort of the obvious place to start my quest. Sort of, it is, and particularly the tour, it is that kind of the kind of one of the ultimate symbols of that kind of mythical, enchanted Britain, and Glastonbury really does have something special about it.
Yeah, it's evocative of everything that the book addresses at the end of the day. So you're right, it's a great place to start. I want to ask you a little bit about the folk revival, and I'm going to put some air quotes around this. Right? So the current. People talk about the fact that there's a current folk revival, like folk ever went away somewhere in the first place. And it didn't. Folk doesn't go away, because the whole folk culture is what gives us our sense of place, our identity in the landscape, in a community group, that shared experience of Glastonbury, all of those sorts of things. What we have is resurgences of interest in folk and folklore and the folk culture. And those are generational as well. They tend to respond to various tensions, post-war, sort of industrial revolution, these sorts of things. So for you, what do you think is driving our current and very strong resurgence of interest in folk generally?
Well, I think there are several layers to it, and you mentioned these kind of previous folk revivals, or kind of folky moments. The post-industrial revolution, post-World Wars, these are moments of vast change, uncertainty, instability, and we're definitely in one of those at the moment. And I think that there's something really grounding about returning to traditions or songs or stories that we know have sort of endured, that we know have been passed on through the generations, that they help us to connect with those who've gone before us. That there's a sense that there's some wisdom in them, right? For these kind of artifacts who have survived, we know that there must be something important and valuable about them. So I think that people are kind of yearning for that sense of grounding and anchoring, anchoring into the land, into particular sort of parts of the country. I think that one major, when I went to Glastonbury, I was talking to neo-pagans, so people who practice what is ultimately a kind of modern faith, again, much like the Wheel of the Year, that's sort of inspired by older pre-Christian kind of spiritual practices with a bit of kind of Victorian sort of fantasy in the mix. And the people that I spoke to who had sort of turned to paganism, which supposedly is, one of now the fastest growing religion in Britain, the environment was such a kind of key aspect. One of the main reasons that people had sort of wanted to kind of reclaim these kind of older spiritual practices, the belief in the kind of sanctity of the natural world, the kind of the animism of the pagan faith, and the way that following the Wheel of the Year sort of could help to sort of reconnect people to these kind of greater natural cycles that we are part of and dependent on. So I think that there's a kind of environmental layer. I think that there's that kind of sense of instability. It connects to a wider trend of sort of people becoming more interested in alternative sort of ways of looking at the world, astrology and sort of other forms of spirituality. There was an interesting report that came out recently about Gen Z sort of becoming more and more spiritual, even as kind of mainstream religions are sort of on the decline in this country. So I think it connects to people searching for answers elsewhere for what it's all about and why we're here. And I think also, as it was for me, a search for an alternative kind of British identity. I think that, as we've seen over the last sort of few years, very sort of toxic and exclusionary visions of particularly Englishness have been getting a lot of airtime. And I think that a lot of people just sort of think, I don't want anything to do with that. But in doing that, they perhaps are rejecting a part of themselves, rejecting their Englishness because they don't want to be sort of lumped in with the far right. And I think that the contemporary folk resurgence is also an expression of that desire to sort of claim an alternative Englishness, one that can be inclusive, one that is rooted in these older traditions, and so I think that's another. So I think it's lots of layers.
Yeah, I think we need to find it somewhere as well because Englishness. We're very bad at that sort of thing compared to other places. St George's Day isn't like Patrick's Day, and so and there's very little mention of St George being Turkish on St George's Day. Anyway,
and that's what's so wonderful about him.
But people choose not to mention that part because that doesn't fit in with the ideal of Englishness that some people are trying to create. But we're very bad at celebrating our identity, I think, compared to a lot of other places, aren't we? Do you agree with that?
Absolutely, yeah. And I think that I kind of write about that in the book because as I mentioned, I spent a lot of time in Wales growing up. My grandparents lived in Wales in a beautiful place called Larne, which is sort of in Carmarthenshire, famous for being the home place for a while of Dylan Thomas. And in Larne, there was such a kind of joyous and infectious sense of national pride that I was exposed to, and you see the red dragon, emblazoned everywhere, and there was, and there was such a kind of pride and Welshness that I sort of was like, yeah, I want a bit of that, and it was sort of a welcoming kind of sense of national pride that was very different, I suppose, to my experience of kind of English nationalism. And so in the book, I'm sort of wondering why is that? And I think there are many aspects to it. I think that the Welsh identity was an identity that was sort of forged in the face of kind of English colonisation. So it's sort of a sense of identity that is sort of about a kind of a pride in traditions and culture that has sort of been suppressed, or there's been an attempt to stamp it out, like with the Welsh language. So I think that's very different to the English. And I think that I kind of write about the kind of flourishing of Welsh national identity in the kind of 18th and 19th centuries, that sort of after the Union of 1707, that although a lot of Welsh kind of symbols, like the leek and the bard and the druid and the kind of triple harp, which are all kind of the official symbols of Welshness, a lot of them were rooted in the kind of older myths and the stories, but that there was this kind of concerted effort to sort of redefine Welshness in that moment as an attempt to come up with a sort of sense of identity that could hold its own within the Union. So that, I don't think we in England have gone through that in the same way, because I think Englishness and Britishness are very kind of mixed up. And I spoke to, when I did the radio series that this book is based on, I spoke to a writer called Alex Niven, and he talked about the kind of English, so almost kind of selling off their sense of identity for that wider project of Britishness. And I think that, could we do with a similar moment in England now of a kind of a conscious sort of conjuring of national symbols and identity, because otherwise we do hand it over to people who perhaps have less welcoming, less sort of open or hopeful visions of what Englishness is.
So let's talk a little bit more about some of these points. So diversity and inclusion, these are covered throughout the book in lots of very different ways. Going back to the Victorian and the Edwardian period, so folk collecting, the collecting of folk traditions, superstitions, music, culture. At that time, this seems to be the domain of what we term the enlightened white male, upper class white men going out and collecting stuff and putting their own narrative to it. Now, Cecil Sharp, very famous folk song collector, he's credited with driving the interest in folk music and folk dance in England. But that isn't really the case, is it? Because he was inspired by somebody else who we'll talk about in a minute. And Cecil Sharp should be celebrated for the collecting that he did, but should perhaps not be celebrated for the way that he went about some of it. But his inspiration came from a very important female. Talk a little bit about her and what she did.
Yes, I will. So I spent quite a lot of time down at Cecil Sharp House in North London, which is the kind of home of English folk and folk song and dance in the present day. And it's a beautiful building, and they've got an incredible library, and sort of, you sit there on one of their kind of big wooden tables, and the Cecil Sharp's bust is sort of there staring at you. And I was sort of like, I don't know how to feel about him. But that, and then there was this moment where, beneath his bust was this book, and it was this woman's face, and she sort of had lovely glowing silver hair, and it was a book about Mary Neal. And I'd heard her name, but in the kind of the sort of dominant kind of folk narrative or mythologies, Cecil Sharp is held up as the sort of the godfather of English folk. So I remember sort of reading this book and just being utterly fascinated, and I was so kind of determined to include her in the book. And Mary Neal was a suffragette. She started a folk club in King's Cross. I think it was seamstress. It was for kind of the working class women of King's Cross. It was called Esperance, and she had this wonderful idea to teach them Morris dancing as a way to sort of lift them from the kind of the grime and the kind of their bleak lives, that they were living at that time. And so she kind of empowered these young women by teaching them Morris dancing, and then they actually began to teach Morris dancing, and they sort of travelled around the country, and they were sort of actually responsible for that kind of revival of interest in Morris. And Cecil Sharp, I think, had already collected some of the kind of the Morris tunes, but he was less interested in the dance. And it was actually sort of off the back of Mary Neal and her Esperance dances that then Cecil Sharp started to take more of an interest in the dances themselves. And yet this story is sort of airbrushed out of the history, and there's this sense that many people have had that women only started Morris dancing in the 70s and 80s. But here we have this incredible story of kind of radical politics, feminism, and folk, really there at the start of that revival. And it was urban. It was in King's Cross. And again, I think this is something that I was trying to do throughout the book, and that I loved doing throughout the book. It was sort of like finding these alternative stories that kind of troubled those dominant narratives a little bit, and it just made them more interesting and more vibrant. And because I think people have this idea of Morris as, obviously I think its roots are mainly rural, but the idea that the kind of the heart of the Morris revival happened in King's Cross in London, I think is really exciting.
And in 1973 a Morris dance team was formed in London called New Esperance Morris. And New Esperance Morris was a women's team that formed to celebrate the work that Mary Neal had done. And for those in the room, next to Zakia here is a display which has come from our collections at the Folklore Library, which Tracy has kindly curated and brought along. And this is original kit from New Esperance Morris. So the smock is from their 1980s kit, and the rest of the sash, which is in the suffrage colours, and the handkerchiefs and bells are from their 2000 year kit. So those are all original items that kind of illustrate what Zakia is talking about here. So New Esperance and the original Esperance danced the Cotswold tradition, traditional English Morris, and on their website, and I would urge you to go and have a look, some really fascinating and well-researched histories of Mary Neal and of the original Esperance Morris. So go and seek those out. So gender, let's move from there to diversity and inclusion in other ways as well. You and I were both part of a project called Folklore Without Borders. This was a funded project through the Higher Education Council to address issues of diversity, or the lack thereof, within folklore as a subject. And Zakia and I both worked on that project. So I want to look at diversity because these things don't just stick around, because Esperance Morris, right? Female Morris, that's great. Female team gets into the tradition, inspires Cecil Sharp. So they stick around forever, right? And women in folk are a big thing since Esperance Morris. No?
No.
No. That's not how it works. So when we look at diversity more generally, talk a little bit about your heritage and your background as a springboard to how perhaps the Albion that you're searching for has a cultural mix that's shifting these days. And the differences and the inherent dangers between cultural acceptance on the one hand and cultural appropriation on the other.
Well, I think another sort of important sort of formative moment on this quest that didn't start with the book, that, you know, I've been on for a long time, was going back to the island of Carriacou, where my grandparents are from, and they moved here as part of the Windrush generation in the 60s. And Carriacou is a tiny island. It's 7 miles long, and you sort of have to get that. You sort of have to get this sort of quite terrifying ferry to land there. So it's a real kind of time capsule, and they've really held on to a lot of traditions of, you know, enslaved people that were brought to the island in the centuries beforehand. And Carriacou is extremely rich, has a really rich folk culture. Alan Lomax, the famous ethnomusicologist, went there in the 60s and recorded lots and lots of songs and stories. And you know, he went back there just before he died. I think it was one of the final trips that he made. And so I feel like he recognised how special Carriacou was. And I went back there and I was making a radio documentary about something called Big Drum, which is a kind of drumming and dance tradition that kind of remembers the names and it remembers the kind of ethnic groups of enslaved people that were brought to the island, in particular dances and drum rhythms. But when I was there, I started hearing about all these other traditions that had quite British roots. There was something called Shakespeare Mass that happens there around Christmas time, and it's almost like, it's kind of like a kind of a mummers play, and people go from village to village, sort of enacting, or basically sort of performing Shakespearean monologues to one another, dressed in these kind of incredible costumes, sort of whacking each other with sticks whenever a line is misremembered. And I think that the kind of Shakespearean aspect is perhaps from a kind of a hangover from the kind of colonial education system. But there was, when you see the costumes and the way that they kind of move through these kind of parishes, it's really similar to mumming tradition. So I sort of became curious about, well, what were there other kind of customs that travelled, British folk customs that travelled across the empire, and it was really important for me to sort of weave these through the book to say that, you know, we should expand our idea of what we could see as a kind of British folk tradition, because, you know, there is maypole dancing in Jamaica that is actually taught in schools up until the present day. There was one a folklorist, a folk researcher, documented a kind of massive Morris dance happening on the island of St. Kitts. And so I was sort of thinking of other examples and not to just say, that the kind of contemporary folk, resurgence or wave or whatever you want to call it, is more diverse than those of the past, but rather that actually there has been this kind of flow and exchange of folk traditions for many centuries. Another fascinating discovery that I kind of uncovered was this amazing lithograph of Jack in the Green, who we will see all around the country tomorrow morning. He's the kind of he's basically a person dressed as a tree with sort of bells and ribbons and sort of kind of wobbles along, often with some Morris dancers in tow. There was this incredible lithograph of the Jack in the Green in Jamaica in 1851 that was kind of etched by a Jewish Jamaican artist who was documenting the costumes of the formerly enslaved people. And you think, that was so long ago. Why do we not know about this? Why do we not know about the Jamaican, Jack in the Green? So there were all of these kind of incredible stories that I just felt that it's one thing to say, yes, it is wonderful that the kind of contemporary folk surge is more diverse, that we've had incredible people like Angeline Morrison, an incredible folk singer who's been not only kind of writing her own folk songs that kind of re-story the kind of histories of the Black British presence, but also has started a new research project of finding those kind of songs in the folk repertoire that make reference to empire and Black people, and there are quite a lot of them, even though they're not always very nice. And she's just started the first Black British folk collective. So yes, it's incredible that this kind of new folk moment is a lot more diverse than those of the past, but it's also important to say, but this isn't new. This isn't a new thing. This isn't somehow changing or altering the tradition. This has been going on for a long time.
And you talked about Notting Hill earlier on as well, and the fact that that's a place that you spend a lot of time around carnival time, and there's a section in the book discussing Notting Hill as well. Have you found that that's changed and shifted much over time as other cultures and the cultural mix has changed within the Notting Hill area, and the representations in the carnival are different now?
Well, yeah, that was another really interesting sort of discovery for me, was that the first Notting Hill, the first kind of carnival parade to actually happen in Notting Hill. So there was the story of Claudia Jones, who was an amazing Trinidadian activist who put on the first Caribbean carnival in Britain. It was indoors. It was sort of in a town hall in King's Cross in January. And she did a few of those. But the first sort of parade to actually sort of process through the streets of Notting Hill was put on by a woman called Rawn Laslett, who was part of the London Free School, which is sort of this kind of alternative educational organisation, sort of with lots of bohemians and radicals and Black Panther activists, and it was sort of a kind of interesting mix of people. In fact, actually, John Michel, the famous writer who he wrote a lot about earth mysteries and ley lines and things like that. Apparently, they used to meet in his basement. So the very first Notting Hill Carnival parade was actually styled as a kind of revival of an old English fair. And there were sort of Irish girl pipers and interpub darts matches and sort of children dressed in Dickensian outfits and things like that, as well as a steel pan band and some of those more Caribbean traditions. And it was this sort of very strange, sort of reenactment of an old English, a kind of new multicultural English fair. And sort of going back even further to the origins of the carnival in Trinidad, the first carnivals that happened in Trinidad and the sort of, Notting Hill Carnival and lots of other Caribbean carnivals today are sort of modelled on those early Trinidadian carnivals. They were a form of entertainment for the white planter class, fusing the kind of Roman Catholic Lenten traditions of the Spanish and the French who were previously on the island, and then the kind of May Day customs of the British who colonised the island afterwards. And it wasn't until after emancipation that the enslaved people sort of took on that tradition and used it as an opportunity to sort of mock their former masters, and they brought in all their kind of West African traditions. And so just looking at that story, I think it's it's just a wonderful example of the way that traditions are constantly in flux, and that they can be used to serve very different needs of very different communities, and the porousness of them, and that is something that is, that even just, bringing it back to St. George, the kind of the Turkish saint with supposedly Palestinian mother who becomes a kind of symbol of kind of Anglo-Saxon Englishness. I mean, it's this happens. This is constantly happening with culture. That things are always kind of in flux and always being reimagined, and I think that's something to celebrate.
You described at the beginning, when you were first listening to Pentangle and becoming interested in this subject, the idea of folklore and tradition in England particularly being kind of eccentric or quirky. And these are words that the national press love to use whenever they describe the traditions in this country, eccentric English people doing eccentric English things. So considering that folklore has this kind of bad rep as being eccentric and quirky and outmoded and ridiculous, why are so many people insistent that it's good for weaponisation?
Well, it's an interesting one. As I kind of mentioned at the start of my quest, I hoped that I would find this unsullied, uncomplicated, utopian vision of Albion that we could all get behind.
Didn't quite pan out, did it, that?
No, and then I found out about blackface and Morris dancing, or, for example, the way that the far right have co-opted folk traditions as to sort of as sort of expressions of a kind of native indigenous Englishness, and that's sort of happening today. I mean, there came across a really disturbing blog post online, and it starts off sort of like, we need to preserve our traditions, and I was like, okay, yeah, and then the writer sort of saying, well, what interest does a Senegalese person or a person of English heritage have in our English traditions? It's not their culture, and with the demographic replacement that's happening in our country, they would seek to destroy it or something like that. And this was a kind of written by a member of Patriotic Alternative, which is a sort of contemporary neo-Nazi group, sort of led by a former member of the BNP. And it's just one example of, folk sort of becoming enmeshed or capitalised on by people, by fascists. And again, that's not a new thing. Some of kind of Cecil Sharp's ilk and colleagues, dabbled with fascism. Famously, Rolf Gardiner, he was sort of champion of the English sword dance, exchanged letters with Joseph Goebbels. So this is not a new thing. And I think that, as you mentioned, that some people are kind of drawn to folk because that it's DIY, it's of the people, it's sort of anti-establishment, and so there's a lot, and obviously particularly in the 60s and 70s, there was a real kind of left, people like Ewan McCall, and there was that kind of left-wing politics associated with folk. But there has also been the opposite, and I think that folk does kind of coalesce quite nicely with sort of ideas of blood and soil, nativism, and those kind of darker sort of aspects. But so yeah, but you're asking me why? How do those things sit together? But I think folk is an expression of people, the people. Yeah. So everything that you find in communities, the good, the bad, the ugly, the Fabian, the fascist, the whole spectrum of human experience, human emotion, of politics, you're going to find it in folk, And I think that so trying to sort of steer folk to sort of serve, a left wing politics or a right wing politics is not. It can be done easily. You will find something there to kind of back up your argument, but it's a reflection of the people, for better or worse. And so it's not all sunshine and roses.
You're absolutely right. I have other questions. I'm just going to wrap up with a couple because I'm aware there are a lot of people in the room who are going to have other questions that they would like to have the opportunity to ask you. So I just want to quickly ask you about Albion Online. Albion.com, right? So online communities, how are they changing our makeup in terms of our engagement with folk and our identity, if indeed they are?
Well, it's quite interesting because, you know, we've talked a lot about this sort of contemporary resurgence of interest in folk, and one of the people that I interviewed in the book, Chloe Middleton Metcalf, who's an amazing researcher and a former Morris dancer. You know, I sort of asked her about this folk revival, and she was like, well, what folk revival? Because she's not on social media. So she was sort of like, to her, you know, sort of going to the folk festivals and you know, in her kind of community, not much had necessarily changed. And so, you know, that was quite interesting to me because, yeah, you know, a lot of this kind of new movement within folk is happening online, it's happening in virtual spaces. And I think there are wonderful things about that. I think it means that, you know, it can reach a kind of much wider range of people. I think that one of the reasons that this kind of contemporary folk moment is a lot more diverse than perhaps some of the folk revivals of the past is that, you know, you don't have to sort of grow up in a village or a town that has a folk tradition. You don't have to go out with folky parents. You don't have to have a dad who takes you to Pentangle to know about this folk thing and to feel that you can be a part of it. And, you know, Lucy Wright, an amazing artist and another folk researcher that I interview in the book, you know, she sort of started a tradition called Hedge Morris that, you know, so usually you just sort of to partake in Morris dance, you'd have to join a side. You know, it usually involves getting out onto cobbled streets or up a hill or on May Day morning. And she created this kind of new online sort of Morris dance that, you know, anyone could be a part of. Even if you can't get out of bed, you can upload a sort of Morris-esque dance and you know create a hashtag and be part of this moment and of this movement. So, you know, this was a way for her to sort of make Morris more inclusive. So I think those are really positive things. There is the kind of commercialization of folk, you know, that the sort of these kind of highly aestheticized kind of you know, lovely videos and reels of an imagery of various folk traditions happening online, and then brands want to be a part of them, and you know, some people aren't very happy about that. And I thought also another aspect is, well, how does that, you know, given that for so long particularly these kind of seasonal customs and songs and tales have, you know, been very much rooted in particular areas, particular landscapes. They're really sort of an expression of a very local sense of identity. What happens then when we're in this kind of liminal space of the interweb, and yeah, like it can sort of create a kind of community around folk, but it's not necessarily a community that's sort of rooted in a particular area. But I don't know. I feel hopeful about it. I think that, you know, perhaps once the kind of media interest wanes and, you know, we haven't got 1,000 Guardian articles talking about the cool revival of folk, you know, there will still be a kind of a wider, more diverse range of people who've kind of caught the folk bug, and that they will continue to sort of you know, preserve and partake in folk in the years to come.
The commercialisation of folklore. The folklore community went absolutely ballistic when Taylor Swift released that album and stole our hashtag. You know, it was online chaos for months and months. Even now, there is a risk of, you know, hashtagging folklore on a post about folklore and getting a load of Swifties come back. Yeah, absolutely. For those that don't like getting up early in the morning, incidentally, Lucy Wright also created a tradition called dusking, which is like getting up really early to do May Day stuff, but you do it at dusk so that you don't have to. And again, that was a solitary practice where you uploaded photos. It was good stuff. Okay, finally then, before we move to some questions from the audience, at the end of your quest, if there is an end to your quest, maybe there isn't an end to your quest, what had Albion become then by the time you finished?
Well, I think we didn't really go into the sort of definitions of Albion necessarily, but I suppose at the start of the book I kind of defined Albion as a kind of an alternative spirit of the nation. And, you know, like I said, I'd hoped to find this kind of, this utopia perhaps, but what I was left with was a kind of a glimpse of a nation that, and a kind of alternative national story that included some of the shadows, that included the darkness, that included, you know, the fascist sides of folk and the kind of the dark histories of empire as expressed in these kind of traditions that were born out of it, as well as the kind of the magic of what it feels like to kind of get up, at 4 a.m. and be part of a May Day parade with a bunch of strangers, or down in Penzance marking the winter solstice, and these kind of mischievous and kind of naughty celebrations that are all about kind of fire and rebellion. And it sort of, I guess the quest forced me to kind of learn a lot more about our history, about those shadowier legacies of empire, but also the tales of rebels who fought against the kind of the oppression and the injustices that have taken place throughout the centuries. Like the Rufford Park poachers who I wrote about, a particular folk song that opened up this incredible history of kind of trespass and political resistance. Going back to the diggers and the Tolpuddle martyrs and all that kind of stuff. So I feel that my search for Albion sort of left me with a more rounded, a more honest, a more kind of nuanced national story, one that could sort of hold the darkness but not be eclipsed by it, and neither sort of use folk as an escape from those more shadowier aspects of our past. And I started to see Albion, I kind of wrote about kind of William Blake and his sort of vision of Albion, of, this, he kind of wrote about Albion being this sort of cosmic sort of giant who kind of represented the soul of the nation, who kind of once contained all of heaven and earth in his limbs, and was this great majestic being who'd fallen into a deathly slumber due to kind of materialism and religious dogma. And yet there was the promise that Albion would rise again. And I really believe that the spirit of Albion, will rise again, and that we have to sort of partake. We have to go out there and seek out those alternative stories, seek out those alternative folk heroes, those fascinating tales, those old songs or new ones, even inventing creating new forms of culture that express this alternative spirit of the nation. I think that a collective endeavour is required if we want to sort of re-enchant the nation. And I do think it's possible, and I do think it's happening. And so I sort of left the sort of, I ended the quest. Did it really end? I don't know if it's finished quite. I'm quite finished with it, but I was left with a feeling of hope, and a feeling of sort of being more grounded, more rooted, and more at peace, and more proud of Britain and my Britishness. And I hope that that's something that other people can get from the book. And I hope that there'll be a festival of Albion where we're all going to create up new traditions around the country, and that's the utopian vision. But at least a little bit more at peace, I feel.
Good.
Yeah.
Good. I mean, there are 40 plus people in this room. I suspect that would give you 40 plus different definitions of what Albion was to each of those people. Let's throw it open to all of you people. Look at that, straight in at the front before I'd even said questions. Go for it.
Jumping at the bit.
Go for it.
Thank you so much. Lovely. So eloquent. You talked quite a bit about the conscientious side of your quest. I'd love to hear if it was relevant at all, if you had, because you started your quest in Glastonbury, I wanted to hear a little bit more. When you said Penzance, I was wondering if you were in St Michael's Mount. So I wanted to hear a little bit. Did you, on your quest, look for any sacred sites, like Avebury or Stonehenge, or were those part of the land at all? Because you kind of mentioned it but skimmed over it. And also, as I said, what you talked about was kind of more the edgy shadow side. Did you have experiences around liminal experiences? Did you have kind of any between? Did you have any more magical experiences, kind of more rather than just the shadow of what you uncovered, but did you also tap into the more nebulous quality of the kind of that quest of Albion?
Yeah, well, yes, I think that kind of ran through, and it was also kind of a big part of the way that I wrote the book, that I kind of had this structure of the Wheel of the Year, and I had this sense, well, I'll probably go here, at this time of the year, but it was really an unfolding. I went into it with an open mind and an open heart, being like, what's the story that the land wants to tell me? And again, that's another sort of aspect of, I suppose, the way that I think about Albion, this idea of kind of spirit of place, that particular landscapes, particular patches, forests, coastlines. There's a spirit of that place that communicates, or the sort of, that if you're a writer or you're a creative, that you can sort of tune into the energy of that particular landscape, and you will create particular expressions as a result. So I like that idea, and I think that was definitely sort of underpinning the quest. I didn't make it to Avebury, but it's not in the book. I ended my quest at Stonehenge for the spring equinox as a sort of completion, and yes, there was a sort of the personal magic of I've been to Stonehenge before, but not for one of those kind of events where you can get up close and personal to the stones. I felt this kind of incredible connection, as you walk up again, at 4 o'clock in the morning, and you do this kind of trek towards the stones. You have this feeling of that you're walking in the footsteps of ancestors, of people who've walked this land in the centuries before you, and there is certainly something magical about that. But I think for me that the real magic that I felt was the magic of community. And, I went to Penzance for a festival called Montol, which is a kind of newer tradition that's sort of based on older kind of Cornish midwinter traditions and the tradition of kind of midwinter misrule. And like with many of the other things events that I attended, I sort of planned to sort of, take photos and take notes from the sidelines, but I actually ended up getting I got involved because I was visiting friends and someone hadn't turned up to be part of the procession. So I ended up sort of donning this wolf mask, dressed head to toe in kind of hemp, in some sort of hemp kind of cloth, and howling at children on the streets of Penzance with a flame torch, and it's interesting because I think before I'd done that, I maybe had this sense that there is this idea that some of these traditions are kind of steeped in older kind of magical practices, or they're kind of old fertility rites, or they will bring about a good harvest, or they it's the act of getting on the streets that will bring the light back. But actually, what I felt was that magic of what happens when a group of people set an intention like that to use your communal resources, not getting money from the council or from these kind of institutional bodies, meeting up throughout the year to just put on this absolutely mental parade just for the love of the community, for the love of the town that you're part of. And that to me was that people power, I think, was the thing that I found the most moving, and it feels like something that we've really that many of us have lost touch with in other parts of the country. Or the sort of that kind of sense of the local has sort of been replaced with other forms of community or other ways of sort of relating to one another. And I think that was the magic for me. It was the magic of coming together and what we can achieve when we band together in service of something greater.
That's lovely. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes.
Thank you for the talk. I was really interested in the way you set things up around the kind of wheel of the year. And I was interested, I suppose, in the question of time more generally. I don't know whether you would agree that perhaps we see these kind of moments of folklore revival when a kind of belief in the future starts to get withdrawn in some kind of way. So we sort of think about the Cold War, for example, as a moment when people started going back into the past, or, Mark Fisher talked about the slow cancellation of the future in the early 2000s, and now we might be thinking about a more rapid cancellation of the future, and how that sense of the sort of circularity and repetition that you evoke so importantly, how that sits alongside other kinds of, you have hope in the future, and you hope for a kind of progressive future that would be different to the past. So I wonder how you see those two things sitting together.
Yeah, and it's kind of, it's interesting because I think a lot of people, as you say, seek out kind of folk and kind of these older traditions or the old ways or whatever you want to call them as a refuge from the present. If we could only get back to the way things were. And it's interesting, when I was thinking thinking about the quest at the start, thinking about my search for Albion and my search for this kind of utopia back there, not that dissimilar to, let's say, the far right, or people who have romanticized visions of great old England and like Great Britain, that kind of post-colonial melancholia. If only we could get back. And I think that we can get stuck there when we're trying to retrieve or reenact or kind of somehow resist the challenges of the present by looking backward. And so, I think that my kind of sense of time in the book is very kind of circular, and I draw upon the kind of traditions of my ancestors in Carriacou, for whom past and present are absolutely enmeshed. I kind of write about a festival called All Souls, which happens around Samhain, around Halloween, and it's a time for kind of going and visiting the graves of ancestors. And there is all this kind of rich belief in Carriacou that your ancestors will visit you in dreams, and that they'll sometimes make demands and sometimes they'll give advice, and that you have to kind of respect them. So if you're building a new house, if you're getting married, if you're any big kind of important moment in your life, there has to be an offering. And it's this idea that we need to pay attention to what happened to those who came before us, because they can meddle with our lives in the present. And whether or not you believe in kind of spirits actually sort of getting involved, I think there's a deep kind of wisdom in that border between the past and the present is porous, and that when we're kind of when we're sort of going back into the past, so that in order to sort of heal or kind of move forward in the present, we often have to sort of have the past in mind. And I start the book with a quote by an amazing Irish writer called John Moriarty, and he says, what was it? Well, just because I think this kind of speaks quite nicely to that idea of non-linearity. Healing in our cultural present will come as a consequence of healing in our cultural past. Out of a healed past, a healed present will grow. So absolutely, although this is ultimately a kind of historical book, it's a book that's thinking of what can we retrieve from the past to help us move towards a more progressive, a more hopeful future. Because if we don't do that dreaming, as you say, there won't be one. Yeah.
There'll be a chance to speak to Zakia afterwards, but we've got time to take one more public question first.
No pressure.
No pressure.
I'll try and do a short answer.
Make it a good one.
Firstly, I just wanted to say it was really nice to hear Hounslow mentioned, because I've been down Treaty many times.
Oh, Jodie, there you go, Treaty Centre. I wouldn't have imagined that being mentioned in Crediton.
There you go.
But then moving on, you said Wales really captured your kind of imagination and understanding of like patriotism in a nice kind of honest form. And I moved to Wales when I was 22 as an English person, and I really kind of felt the brunt of the anti-English element of Wales. So kind of wanted to think about that. They are fiercely patriotic, but sometimes to the point of not being very neighbourly with it. And I don't know whether you experience much of that. But my main question is about the Welsh tradition of the Mary Clwyd.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I wondered if you looked into that very much, because I found that really surreal. I don't know if anybody else has heard of that, but it's just similar to the Wolf's Head, I suppose you mentioned.
Yeah.
When you went to down to Cornwall, but yeah, I just thought, what were your thoughts on that?
I didn't get to see the Mary Lloyd, unfortunately, but that's an incredible.
What is it?
It's basically around it's a Christmas time masquerade, isn't it? And so it's sort of basically a big terrifying horse's head is sort of paraded through horse's skull
on a wooden
on a stick that's sort of paraded through, and sort of going door to door. And the idea, people sort of almost engage in a kind of rap battle, folklore rap battle, where they kind of, if you don't sort of offer the right kind of words in return, you have to pay, or it's kind of like supposedly to bring good luck for the year ahead. But unfortunately, I didn't get to see that one. But yes, I think I kind of write in the book about the Welsh involvement in empire, and so there's this idea that so after the Union, both kind of the Welsh and the Scots sort of kind of got involved in that British project, and Wales benefited massively off the back of that. Welsh industry was kind of central to that kind of imperial project. Welsh wool, Welsh iron, used to kind of make the shackles to kind of keep slaves in in bondage. So, and so that more recently there's kind of been a kind of rejection of that kind of British project and that British identity. And the Welsh sort of focusing a little bit on being the colonised, but sort of not so much of a discussion about also being part of that colonising enterprise. And so, yeah, it's complicated, it's complex. But also Larne, where I spent a lot of time, was a kind of, I think in the 12th century, was sort of like an English colony within Wales. So it was a sort of not a totally traditional Welsh place. So we didn't get too much of the anti-English stuff. But then again, my granddad was a legend in the pub. So I think that's why. Yeah.
Okay, we're going to have to wrap it up at that point. I am legally obliged by the Bookery to tell you that books by both myself and Zakia are available here. But please, Zakia's book has been longlisted for the Women's Prize for a very good reason. We have only scratched the surface of what is a wealth of material, and you can redeem the price of your ticket for this event against a copy of Zakia's book. So please buy her books. Okay?
Buy his book as well.
Right.
Yeah, buy both.
All right. It's a bookshop. Many books are available. Feel free to browse. But most importantly, please show your appreciation to Zakia.
Thank you. Woo! Thank you.
Okay. You can find Zakia hosting Dreamtime on BBC Radio 6 Music, and her book, Finding Albion, is available in all good bookshops. I am thankful to Zakia for agreeing to record our interview for you all, and also to Pentangle, the band who first inspired Zakia on her journey, for giving me a copy of their track The Cuckoo and clearing the rights for the extract that you heard in the show. YouTube and Spotify algorithms take note. I have written permission. We are one step closer to my very special 200th episode, which will be coming soon, and I can't wait to present that one to you. If there's interest, I'm also considering recording an Ask Me Anything show to coincide with that. If you like that idea and you have questions about my work or anything else, within reason, that you'd like me to consider answering, then please email me at thefolklorepodcast@gmail.com and we'll see if that comes off. I'll be back soon with another episode. In the meantime, you can get more free content as well as exclusive extra material for a small subscription over on the Folklore Podcast Patreon page. I'm hoping to give that a facelift for the 200th celebrations too, so it's a great time to join. You can do that for free and then upgrade later if you like what you see and hear. Everything can be found at patreon.com/thefolklorepodcast. Thanks for listening. See you next time.